Introduction, Mapping the Realms, a 10-chapter journey through global, ancient, and spiritual cartography. Before man spoke, he walked. Before he ruled, he wandered. And before he ever claimed a land, he mapped it with ash, blood, and starlight. This book is not about maps, it is about meaning. About what humans have always done when confronted with the vast, the invisible, and the divine. We draw it. We trace the edges, we call chaos a name. From the first cave-scratched constellation to modern satellite networks orbiting Earth, mapping has been an act of myth-making as much as measurement. This is not just history, it is revelation. A chronicle of how we inscribed our fears, gods, and dreams onto the world, and beyond it. What this book is. This is a 10-chapter descent into the cartographic unconscious of humanity, a chronicle of how we mapped, the land we walked, the heavens we feared, the underworlds we fled, the sacred places we remembered, the empires we forced, the dreams we whispered, the realms that religions revealed, the geometries hidden in our cells, temples, and stars. It is a ruthless, poetic, brutally honest dissection of every map that mattered, and many that were silenced. Why it matters because every map is a claim. And every claim is a story someone wanted remembered or someone else wanted erased. Maps were not neutral. They were weapons, prayers, gateways, and tombs. They colonized not just land but imagination, and they were always tools of both control and liberation. To understand them is to understand how the world was shaped, spiritually, politically, cosmically, and how it can be reshaped. Who? This book is written for seekers of hidden knowledge, historians with scorched hands, the spiritually curious, the academically vicious, and the romantics who still believe there are realms beneath the ruins. It honors all traditions. Christian, Hindu, Islamic, Buddhist, pagan, indigenous, mystical, hermetic. We do not elevate one over the other. We map all realms, material and metaphysical, with equal precision. How to read this book. Each chapter is a domain, a layer, a world. 1. The first maps in prehistoric memory. 2. Sacred geography in ancient civilizations. 3. Mythic realms and divine cartographies. 4. Empires, borders, and the politics of space. 5. Resistance maps and forbidden lands. 7. Dream maps and psychogeographies. 8. Cosmic architectures and the divine grid. 9. The future of mapping and its weaponization. 10. Sacred geometry, heaven, and the cosmic web. The final section catalogs every realm, archive, and document mentioned. It is both index and altar. Read it linearly or skip like a traveler in a strange land. Either way, take notes, draw margins, follow symbols. This is not a passive read. It is a pilgrimage. A whisper from the author. You don't have to believe in Eden or Atlantis. In ley lines or cosmic grids. In demons etched into medieval star charts or angels drawn by forgotten monks. But you must understand this. Someone did, and they mapped it with trembling hands, and their map shaped the world you live in. So open this book as you would an ancient scroll or a forbidden spell. Read with reverence, doubt with elegance, and map as if your soul depends on it, because in a way, it does. Chapter 1. The First Flame, Mapping Consciousness Before Civilization. By L. Virgo. Virgo 82. The first map was not drawn, it was dreamed. It began before fire had a name, before language gave bones to thought. Humanity's first maps were not of land, but of meaning. They were whispers across dimensions, encoded in instinct, dream, and dread. They didn't need parchment. They burned themselves into memory, into blood. These proto-maps were alive. They sang, wept, and guided us not just through terrain, but through destiny. We are not beginning with Sumer, or Egypt. We are going back before the flood, before Babel, before Saturn ate his sons. We are tracing the cartography of humanity's first directional urge, the need to orient the soul in a world too wide, too cruel, too divine to wander blindly. The map of Eden, geography of the untouched. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden. Genesis 2:10. Long ridiculed as a myth, the Garden of Eden contains one of the earliest surviving sacred geographic references. Described as being nourished by 4 rivers, the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates, this map was not metaphor. It was a literal orientation, a divine center point, the original axis mundi, guarded by cherubim and severed from mortal return. Pishon, said to encircle Havilah, a land of gold, possibly linked to India or Arabia. Gihon, linked by some to the Nile or to an ancient, now-buried African river. Tigris and Euphrates, the only rivers still standing, physical reminders of spiritual geography. Biblical scholars, Islamic geographers, and even Sumerian syncretists have attempted to trace Eden's map, sometimes placing it in Mesopotamia, other times in Ethiopia, or deep beneath the crust of this world, shielded from our sight. Wherever it lies, Eden was a place where space obeyed morality, where terrain was not passive, it judged. 2. Aboriginal songlines, the earth that sings itself before writing, there was walking, and singing. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia mapped their world using songlines, ancestral tracks that crisscrossed the landscape, telling stories of the dreaming, the eternal spiritual realm overlapping the physical. Each songline mapped real topography, watering holes, animal migration paths, sacred stones, carried mythological resonance, tying the singer to their tribe's divine ancestors, was passed down orally, meaning entire geographic systems were memorized via poetry. Modern GPS systems would envy the precision of this system. This was mapping as spiritual inheritance, as survival. They sang, and the earth answered. And 3rd, the caves that held the cosmos. In the Chauvet Cave, France, 36,000 BCE, Lascaux and El Castillo, we find the earliest celestial cartography, constellations painted in ochre and ash, the Pleiades, Taurus, and lunar cycles scratched into the walls by Paleolithic mystics. Why map the stars in a cave? Because these caves were wombs, gateways to the underworld, echo chambers of ritual. These were temples before temples existed. The stars above were charted to guide the soul through the terrain of death. They didn't map to find. They mapped to return. Pre-flood civilizations. The forbidden geography. Many sacred traditions speak of an antediluvian world, a time before cataclysm when knowledge flowed like rivers and mapping was not just of land, but of the stars and the soul. The city of Eridu, oldest city in Mesopotamia, was laid out according to cosmic axes. The Babylonian world map, Imago Mundi, c. 600 BCE, is a spiritual projection of the world, not scale accurate but theologically true. Enochian testimonies, the Book of Enoch, apocryphal but widely revered, details the heavens, hells, and 364-day cosmic calendar. Describes portals through which the sun and moon travel, possibly the earliest record of dimensional or astral cartography. Mentions watchers, fallen angels, and a buried cosmology of giants and judgment. The maps of pre-flood Earth were destroyed, but their ghosts remain in the cracks of myth. V. Meru, axis of the universe. In the east, the mountain was the map. Mount Meru, the sacred cosmic mountain in Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist cosmology, stood at the center of the physical and spiritual universe. Height, 84,000 yojanas, impossibly vast, surrounded by 7 concentric mountain ranges and 7 oceans. Crowned by the abode of the gods, Meru is not metaphor. In Buddhist mandalas, everything from desire to death is mapped with Meru at the heart. Meru is not where earth meets heaven. Meru is heaven compacted into form. But the map is the mind before cartography. There was consciousness. Before grids, there was gnosis. The first maps were mental, oral geographies of nomads and tribal hunters. Mythic cosmograms passed through chants and war paint. The hallucinatory vision maps drawn in trance, from Siberian shamans to Amazonian ayahuasqueros. The invisible lines drawn between ancestor and place, god and gesture, womb and weapon. These first maps could not be colonized because they were internal. End of chapter reflection. To map is to name. To name is to claim. To claim is to kill, unless you remember that what you name was already alive. El Virgo. What we call myth is not less real than mountain. Every spiritual realm, from Eden to Olympus, Meru to Mictlan, is a mental terrestrial spiritual geography layered atop each other like palimpsests. The deeper you dig into stone, into bone, into blood, the more maps you find whispering, "We were here first." Chapter 2, The Divine Geometry, Mapping by the Will of the Gods, by El Virgo, Fel Virgo 82. Before man measured the world, the gods etched it in fire. To map a world is to reduce it. But the ancients did not reduce, they revered. The earliest architectures were not shelters, but shrines, and they were not built for men, but for gods, with gods, sometimes against them. In this chapter, we enter the era where humanity shifted from dreaming the map to building it, laying stone and blood into alignment with the cosmos. The sacred rule, measured for myth geometry from the Greek geo, earth, and metron, measure, was never secular. It was ritual precision. Ancient peoples believed that incorrect measurements could offend the gods, destabilize fate, or invite calamity. The architect was a priest, the surveyor, a prophet, the mapmaker, a mediator between the divine ideal and the earthly approximation. This idea birthed the golden ratio, found in temples, tombs, and texts from Egypt to India, the square and the circle, heaven and earth, locked in eternal dialogue. The mandala, not a drawing, but a portal. To build wrongly was heresy. To build rightly was worship. 2. Egypt. Mapping for the dead, from the stars. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids to Orion's belt and their temples to Sirius, the star that heralded the flooding of the Nile. Why? Because for them, the stars were not decorative. They were documents, divine inscriptions. The pharaoh was a god, and gods deserved orientation, not just to the cardinal points, but to the afterlife itself. The Book of the Dead is not merely a funerary text. It is a map of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, complete with gates, guardians, and instructions. Every pyramid, every tomb was a map in stone, guiding the soul through celestial checkpoints. To map death was to ensure rebirth. 3rd, the Vedic cosmogram, temples as micro-universes. In the Vedas, the earth is not flat, it is sacred. The Vastu Purusha mandala is a sacred grid, still used in Hindu temple design today. This 81 or 64 square grid plots out cosmic energy flow, designates each square to a specific deity or force, centers on Brahman, the divine absolute. The temple becomes a cosmos in miniature. To enter is not to visit, but to cross thresholds, from illusion to truth, flesh to spirit. Similarly, in Buddhism, mandalas were constructed to map realms of enlightenment, desire, and meditation. When destroyed in ritual, they remind us, the universe is beautiful, but impermanent. Ifer, Mesoamerica, maps that bleed. The Maya and Aztec didn't draw maps on parchment. They built them into cities, each lay out a mirror of the sky. Teotihuacan, aligned with the Pleiades, its roads are Milky Ways in stone. Tenochtitlan, a literal axis mundi, a city island at the world's center, Chichen Itza, where the serpent descends on the equinox. Blood sacrifice was not barbaric to them, it was transactional cartography. It fed the gods who kept the sun moving. Without offerings, the map would collapse. Their entire society was built to maintain the balance of realms. Without maps, they believed the sky would fall. V. The dragon lines, invisible geographies of power. In ancient China, mapping was inseparable from energy. The concept of feng shui, literally wind and water, is a geomantic system mapping qi, life force energy, across land. The imperial palace, forbidden city, and tombs of emperors were constructed at exact points on dragon veins, ley-like paths of concentrated power. To build a structure without honoring these forces meant courting chaos. Even cities were cartographic weapons, designed to trap demons, reflect constellations, or act as celestial mirrors to heaven. The cosmic cities, holy alignments. Across the ancient world, we find cities and temples aligned with celestial events. Stonehenge, winter and summer solstices, Göbekli Tepe, 10,000 BCE, aligned with Sirius ziggurats of Sumer, stairways not to heaven, but to the heavens, Jerusalem, placed atop Moriah, triangulated by prophecy, Petra, carven architecture aligned with the sun's zenith. These were not accidents. The ancients believed that if you could align your city, soul, or spear with the cosmos, you could borrow its power, set the map as mandate. You were king, not because of who your father was, but because you were born under the right star alignment. You conquered the navel of the world. You could interpret the divine map better than your enemies. The mandate of heaven, Zhou China, was a cosmic approval rating. The gods would revoke your coordinates. Maps could bless, they could condemn. End of chapter reflection. When the gods gave man space, it was not empty, it was sacred. Every measurement is a prayer. Every temple is a map of something higher, hidden in the bones of earth. El Virgo here, we see that the first true cartographers were not explorers, but priests. They mapped not where we were, but where we stood between gods, demons, and stars. Space was not neutral, it was judging us. Chapter 3. Conquest and coordinates empires and the war over space. When the gods ceased speaking, kings picked up the pen, and they drew blood instead of borders. The sacred gave way to the sovereign, and the map, once a whispered hymn to divinity, became a declaration of war. A new age dawned. Land became currency, lines became law, and the earth, once a body of the divine, became a thing to be dissected. This is where mapping turned political, and with politics comes possession, and with possession comes obliteration. The birth of empire, mapping to own. The first true empires, Akkad, Assyria, Babylon, rose not merely by sword but by record. Maps were now property documents, boundary agreements, taxation tools. Where once cartography flowed from the divine, it now flowed from palatial archives, royal scribes, and military scouts. To inscribe land was to claim it. To erase names was to erase people. The god-kings didn't just conquer, they remapped. To Babylon. The first world map and its lies. The Babylonian world map, Imago Mundi, was an audacious claim, a stone-etched world view from c. 600 BCE. It places Babylon at the center of the world, surrounded by continents labeled unknowable or monsters dwell here. This was propaganda, the first political map shrinking reality to fit the ego of empire. It showed the Euphrates flowing centrally. 7 outer regions shaped like triangles, marked only by myth. The known world oriented toward Babylon, not truth. Thus began the long tradition of maps as mirrors of power, not accuracy. Third, Alexander and the Hellenic grid. Alexander the Great didn't just conquer terrain. He connected it, forcing the lands of Egypt, Persia, and India into a shared geometry of power. Greek philosophers like Anaximander and Ptolemy redefined the map, introduced latitude and longitude, created maps that stretched from Iberia to the Indus, used geometry to mask colonialism as science. Where the gods had ruled the cosmos, now Greek reason claimed it. Every new city he founded, Alexandria, was a node on a growing imperial lattice. The map no longer served the divine. It served the will of men who believed themselves gods. Font Rome. The map as machine. The Romans perfected mapping as logistics. Roads, forts, aqueducts, all laid down according to exact spatial logic. The world was not sacred, it was manageable. They created the Peutinger table, a distorted network-style map used for military planning, a centralized system of itineraria, route maps, posted at way stations, cadastral maps, used to redistribute land seized from conquered peoples. Rome's maps didn't care about terrain. They cared about control. Make the map so the army can follow it. Then redraw it once the army has won. V. China. The mandate maps eastward. The Han Dynasty created some of the earliest topographic maps, not for curiosity, but for domination. The emperor was the son of heaven. his lands, a reflection of the celestial order. Anything unmapped was unruly, barbaric, or invisible. Under the Qin and Han, mapping served to justify expansion, track populations, enforce taxation, subdue distant peoples by integrating them into cosmographic ideology. The maps bore mountains, rivers, and roads, but more importantly, they bore loyalty. Regions were not merely drawn, they were named and numbered to fit the court's ideology. Myth versus Empire, maps in resistance. Wherever there were empires mapping the world into clean rectangles, there were peoples who refused to be boxed in. The Celts refused to chart their territory, believing land had spirit, not borders. The indigenous peoples of the Americas mapped via stories and symbols, not straight lines. In Africa, the Yoruba mapped Orun, heaven, and Aye, earth, in circular cosmograms, not imperial grids. In Norse cosmology, the 9 realms defied geometry, existing atop Yggdrasil, the world tree, a spatial model the Roman mind could never conquer. These were not primitive systems. They were defiant systems, maps of resistance, faith, and memory. Am 7th, Death. By cartography. You cannot kill a people without first redrawing them. Every time a land was conquered, its maps were rewritten, cities renamed, rivers redirected, old sacred sites erased or rebuilt as fortresses. Oral geographies forgotten under scroll and sword mapping became a weapon of erasure, a quiet genocide by ink and grid. The map was now a script of imperial propaganda, more dangerous than the spear because it made conquest look like truth. End of chapter reflection. When the gods stepped back, the kings moved in. And where kings failed, cartographers finished the job. Chapter 3 reveals that the map had evolved, from ritual to rhetoric, from altar to asset. And with each new empire came a new version of the earth, one that served only those in power, but the sacred was not dead. It waited, beneath the lines and forgotten names and stars not yet erased. Chapter 4. Myths, monsters, and the margins of the medieval map, where heaven ends and hell begins. The truth was never in the center. It was always in the margins, where the beasts breathe. Welcome to the world after empire, after reason tried and failed to cage the cosmos. The medieval period did not abandon the map. It sanctified, feared, and weaponized it. This was no longer just cartography. This was theology, heresy, and terror, inked. The map became a mirror of the soul, and what it showed wasn't geography, it was judgment. The Tiando maps, a cross for the world. The most iconic Christian map of the Middle Ages was the T and O map, shaped like the Holy Cross, Asia above, home of Paradise Eden, Europe at the bottom left, Africa at the bottom, right Jerusalem at the center, enclosed in an O for Orbis Terrarum, the circle of the world. This wasn't meant to be geographically accurate. It was meant to be morally accurate. The map said, here is the holy, here is the damned, here is where Christ walked. Here is where monsters wait. 2. The margin creatures, symbols of sin, secrets, and sex. At the edges of these maps were not blank spaces, but beasts, cynocephaly, dog-headed men, blemmies, headless beings with faces in their chests, cyopods, one-legged people who shaded themselves with their foot dragons, serpents, giants, men with tails, and breeding demons. These were not just artistic embellishments. They were warnings. The further you strayed from the center, from Christ, from church, from Rome, the closer you came to damnation. Maps became cautionary tales. Every monster was a metaphor. Every sea creature was a sin given shape. 3. Erotic cartography. Lust in the lines. Not all monsters were hideous. Some maps hid temptation within them. Islands shaped like naked women, oceans swirling like serpent bodies, borderlands filled with sultry pagan dancers. These features weren't always recorded in text. They were drawn in suggestion, in curves, folds, shadows. The map was a veil, and those who gazed too long could lose their way in more than one sense. To read a medieval map was to risk spiritual danger. It was an act of intellectual lust. 4. Paradise located. The lost Garden of Eden. Eden was not a myth to medieval cartographers. It was a place fixed in the east, usually above Asia, beyond known lands, guarded by flaming swords and unknowable waters. Eden was shown as a perfect circle or square fed by 4 rivers: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, Euphrates, inaccessible, yet mapped anyway. It symbolized the beginning but also the end, because to return to Eden was to escape this world altogether. Some believed the 10 lost tribes of Israel had found a way back. Others thought Eden had risen into the sky, out of reach. But they all agreed you could still draw it. V. Hell mapped below. If Eden sat at the summit of the world, hell seethed beneath it. Hell wasn't merely imagined, it was plotted. Dante's Inferno gave it shape. 9 circles, each ruled by its own sin and logic. Some maps of Europe showed cracks in the earth where devils emerged. Volcanoes became portals. Deserts became wombs of wrath. You could draw hell as a city, a fortress, even a labyrinth. You could descend through sin like passing borders. Every damned soul had an address. Heaven had shrines. Hell had infrastructure. 6. Portolan charts, where science tried to sneak in. While the church reigned over cosmic cartography, sailors rebelled quietly with Portolan charts. These maps were purely navigational, had no monsters, focused on coastlines, winds, and compass roses, used rum lines to plot real, measurable travel. They didn't erase the sacred. They simply ignored it. A heresy in its own right. These were maps made by men who had to live, who didn't care where Eden was, only where the next harbor lay. 7. Fantasy as territory. Maps of mythical lands. In the margins of medieval maps, you also find phantom lands, mirage kingdoms, and hidden realms, such as High Brazil, the vanishing island west of Ireland; Thule, a shadow land beyond the north wind; Prester John's kingdom, a Christian empire in the east, never found Asgard and Midgard, woven into Norse mythologies, never plotted, but often whispered as real. To many, these places existed in a different kind of truth, a spiritual truth. And if you believed hard enough, you could reach them. They were never meant for ships. They were meant for the soul. End of chapter reflection. The map was never for travel. It was for terror, for theology, for trembling. To stray from the known was not just foolish, it was damnable. In this age, the cartographer was not a scientist, but a scribe of the divine. They charted not the world as it was, but the world as the church demanded it be. A world where heresy had borders and paradise had coordinates. But the veil would not last forever. The age of discovery approaches. The monsters will fall off the edge. The oceans will widen. The stars will be weaponized. Chapter 5. When the world cracked open. The age of discovery and the cartographic renaissance. The monster at the edge of the world was not a dragon. It was the man with the compass. They called it discovery, a clean word, surgical, sanitized. But this was not curiosity. It was conquest with a sextant. The world was not being found. It was being split open, bled, and redrawn. Maps became contracts, confessions, and conspiracies. The age of discovery was not about finding new lands. It was about deciding who owned them. The pen did more damage than the sword ever could. 1492, the year the earth was broken. Columbus did not find a new world. He rewrote the old one. His voyages birthed a new breed of map, one that expanded the world while shrinking its meaning. Before, the world was holy, monstrous, metaphysical. After, the world was measured, valued, and priced. Columbus's maps weren't mistakes. They were propaganda, claiming islands as empty, peoples as passive, and oceans as blank slates for European ink. The world didn't get bigger. It got divided deso, the map as scalpel. Dividing the earth in 1494, Spain and Portugal carved the world in two with the Treaty of Tordesillas. A line was drawn from pole to pole. Everything west belonged to Spain. Everything east to Portugal, lands not yet discovered, were already claimed. A map was used to cut continents like meat, without ever stepping foot on them. This was cartographic colonialism, and it set the precedent for the next 400 years. If it is not on our map, it is not yours. If we draw it first, we own it. 3. Mercator. The Mercator projection. Preserved accurate angles for navigation, massively distorted size. Greenland as big as Africa, centered Europe as dominant. This was the map that colonizers, missionaries, and merchants carried in their pockets. It told them, you are the center, you are the savior, you are the measure of all things. Accuracy was sacrificed for authority. 4. The rise of nautical dominance. With new oceans came new tools, astrolabes and sextants to measure stars. Longitude still elusive, solved only centuries later. Maps now featured compass roses, rum lines, trade winds. Sailors became scientists, scientists became spies. Cartographers became kings. Every sea route was a vein, and the European empires were now vampires. V. Indigenous, erasure and resistance. Maps of the New World did not just forget the native peoples. They erased their entire cosmologies. Where once there were story maps, sacred trails, seasonal markers, sky-based calendars, now there were only straight lines, colonial borders, plantation grids, resources labeled for extraction. But resistance survived. Inuit mapsticks, tactile memory of coasts, Aboriginal songlines, oral geographies defying ink Aztec codices, recording the world in glyph and symbol even as Spaniards torched them. The map became a battlefield. Silence was forced but never complete. 6. The Empire of Cartographers. By the 1600s, maps were no longer tools, they were products. Luxury items, political weapons. Ortelius's Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, 1570, was the first modern atlas. John Speed, Blaeu, and others turned maps into status symbols. The rise of national mapping agencies, like France's Cassini project, birthed the state as surveyor. You could now buy the world and hang it on your wall. What was once sacred was now a commodity. What was once oral, circular, and cosmic was now rectangular, European, and absolute. 7th, the lost places. But not everything was claimed. There remained terra incognita, the unknown lands, Antarctica, imagined before it was seen, El Dorado, Atlantis, Shambhala, the kingdom of Prester John. Some lands disappeared between editions. Some existed only in letters, dreams, or royal lies. These were the ghost zones, places wished into being or exiled from reality. They are still with us in forgotten books, in the gaps of satellite feeds, in the way some maps still leave blank corners, as if ashamed to admit they know too much. End of chapter reflection. The world was not discovered. It was disguised, and the map was the mask. The age of discovery gave us the globe, but it did not give us the truth. It gave us ownership instead of knowledge, borders instead of belonging, and silence instead of stories. Chapter 6. The Enlightened Eye Maps, Science, and the Geometry of Control. They replaced monsters with measurements, saints with surveyors. But the gods didn't die. They were renamed latitude, longitude, empire. The Enlightenment is often praised as the dawn of reason, of light, logic, and liberation. But in the shadows of its intellect, another force emerged, precision as power. In this age, the map ceased to whisper. It began to dictate, not because it was truthful, but because it was rational. The rise of survey, science, measure, therefore conquer. Enlightenment-era maps were obsessed with exactitude. Triangulation became the holy right, baseline measurements laid across plains like threads of dominion. National mapping projects turned countryside into code. France's Cassini family created the first scientifically accurate map of an entire nation using mathematical surveying. The result? A map where villages could be taxed more efficiently, conscripts could be found and drafted, land could be seized, divided, and sold. The Enlightenment didn't just shine light, it cast lines. 2. Longitude, the final puzzle. For centuries, longitude was the cartographer's curse. Latitude could be found by the stars, but longitude, it required time. The solution came with John Harrison's marine chronometer, 1760s, a clock that kept perfect time at sea, allowing sailors to measure how far they were from a known meridian. It changed everything. The seas became gridded, navigable, surveilled, no more wandering. Now the oceans could be owned. 3. The bureaucratization of the maps became filed, cataloged, standardized. With the rise of national archives, military cartography bureaus, land registries, borders once drawn in blood were now drawn in bureau ink. The Enlightenment loved the line. Political boundaries hardened, property lines multiplied. Cities were zoned, measured, and mapped from above like anthills. The map was no longer sacred or magical. It was legal. And legality, more than faith or fear, now shaped the world. Maps as weapons of the state enlightenment. Cartography served empire, routes for conquest, capital, mines, plantations, trade ports. War, siege plans, fort blueprints, invasion maps. Napoleon famously said, "A good sketch is better than a long speech." Every campaign had a map. Every map was a manifesto in lines. To map was to preemptively dominate, via the invisible violence of grids. What was lost in all this precision? Indigenous non-linear maps were discarded as childish. Spiritual geographies were deemed irrational. Oral mapping was unmappable and thus erased. The Enlightenment made a simple claim: if it cannot be drawn, it does not exist. But Eden cannot be triangulated. Asgard does not obey latitude. Hell has no coordinates. And heaven, if mapped, would reject every ruler. Yet in this era, such truths were laughed out of the academy. 6. Cosmic cartography, the science of stars. Even the heavens were now claimed by measurement. Star charts were redrawn with telescopic accuracy. Celestial atlases mapped galaxies as if they were neighborhoods. The Earth's place in the cosmos became a set of coordinates. Not a story, Copernicus had shattered the medieval cosmos. Galileo had given it moons. Now Herschel and Flamsteed gave it names, charts, numbers. The constellations, once worshipped as gods, were demoted to points in space. They mapped the heavens and in doing so emptied them. 7th, the ideal map, a dead map. The Enlightenment dreamed of a perfect map, absolute accuracy, complete coverage, universal standards, total visibility. But in seeking this perfection, the map became soulless. It had no myths, no monsters, no margins. It was blank in all the wrong ways. A world mapped perfectly is a world that cannot surprise, a world that forgets how to dream. End of chapter reflection. The monster is not outside the map. The monster is the map. In its quest for reason, the Enlightenment gave us maps that measured everything and understood nothing. It stripped the earth of story and replaced it with statistics. It turned place into space and space into property. But below this sterile surface, other maps still breathed. Maps of resistance, memory, and madness. Chapter 7. Empire in Ink, Colonial Cartography, and the Theft of the World. First they sent the missionaries. Then they sent the guns. But before both came the map. This chapter opens with a single truth. The map was the first act of colonization. Before a place could be conquered, it had to be named, outlined, flattened, and emptied. Colonial cartography did not discover the world. It rewrote it, in Europe's image and Europe's favor. The tools were not just ships and steel. They were rulers, compasses, and ink soaked in delusion. The map. As a preemptive strike. What is a border, if not a line drawn by someone who isn't there? In Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania, maps were drawn before the land was fully explored. Treaties signed based on fictional coordinates. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries were labeled as tribes. Rivers were renamed, mountains erased if inconvenient to a straight line. They mapped what they wanted, not what was. Maps were tools of legal violence. They gave European powers justification for invasion, slavery, extraction, and once printed, they could not be argued with. A map said, "This is how the world is," and the world was forced to comply. And second, the Berlin Conference, geography on the chopping block in 1884-85, the Berlin Conference carved Africa like a cadaver on a white table. No Africans were present. Yet, borders were drawn with no regard for language, culture, tribe, or geography. Entire ethnic groups split between rival empires, enemies trapped inside artificial nations, resources redistributed on paper before they were ever touched. With ink and arrogance, they stole centuries of sovereignty. These maps still haunt us. Many modern conflicts are the aftershocks of colonial cartography. Third, maps of lies, the cartography of justification. Colonial maps rarely admitted their own fictions. They were filled with blank spaces labeled uninhabited, decorated with drawings of passive natives, wild beasts, or idyllic paradise, annotated with phrases like discovered by, civilized by, granted to. This was not documentation. It was propaganda. The map did not just tell you where you were, it told you who mattered. And in every case, that answer was Europe. What? The erasure of indigenous geography. Entire cartographies were destroyed or ignored. Polynesian stick charts, navigational genius without compasses, Lakota winter counts, calendars tied to place and memory, Aboriginal song lines, land remembered through music Mesoamerican codices, multi-dimensional space, spiritually bound, but they were called primitive, mythic, non-scientific. So they were burned, banned, buried, or left to rot in museums. The colonizers didn't believe what they couldn't translate, so they killed it. Theological imperialism. Maps were also used to convert the soul. Missionary maps showed Africa as a dark void waiting for Christian light. Heaven was drawn above Europe, hell below foreign lands. Biblical geography was reinterpreted to claim dominion. Ham's curse mapped over African skin. Indigenous sacred sites were erased and replaced with churches, crosses, or colonial monuments. Maps became weapons in a holy war of erasure. 6. The map as resource ledger. Colonial maps emphasized mines, rivers, railroads, ports. People were incidental. A good map to the imperialist was one that showed what could be taken. This is why early maps of the Congo focus obsessively on rubber zones, labor camps, rail lines, and not the millions who lived there. The land was not mapped to honor it. It was mapped to exploit it. 7. The hidden places, where maps dare not go yet, not every place was touched. Some locations defied mapping. Sacred mountains, locals refused to describe forests too dense for surveyors. Islands that moved or disappeared, cities whispered in legend. Never confirmed colonial cartographers labeled them unknown, superstitious zone, here be nothing. But those were the places where the old maps still lived, the soul of geography hiding just out of sight. End of chapter reflection. The map said, "This is the world." But the world never agreed. Colonialism turned maps into contracts, into lies so well drawn they became law. But these maps were not neutral, they were loaded weapons. And in their lines, millions were displaced, erased, or enslaved. Chapter 8. The Satellite Panopticon, Mapping the Modern World from Above. God used to look down from heaven. Now it's Google. The eye sees all, but does not blink. The map is no longer a parchment. It is a network. No longer etched in ink, but encoded in data, tethered to satellites, servers, and surveillance. The world isn't just mapped now. It's monitored, modeled, monetized. The cartographer is dead. Long live the algorithm. The Earth from space, surveillance as salvation. In 1972, the Landsat program gave humanity its first true global gaze. From orbit, Earth was captured in full color, a planet exposed. What began as awe quickly became agricultural analysis, resource tracking, military reconnaissance. Now, Google Earth, GIS systems, and private satellite fleets watch everything. Cities grow in real-time, forests disappear pixel by pixel. Borders no longer protect. They report, Your village is no longer forgotten, but it is no longer free to GPS. Global positioning, personal submission. The global positioning system, originally designed for U.S. military targeting, now tracks civilians' cars, children lovers, protesters. Every phone is a beacon. Every footstep a coordinate. You are a dot on a map you don't control. And if that dot ever disappears, the system notices. The map no longer describes you. It defines you. 3. Smart maps. When the map thinks for you. Welcome to algorithmic geography. Maps now suggest your route, predict your desires, sell you detours, filter the world through bias. What you see on your screen is curated, ranked, and tailored, not to truth, but to profit and persuasion. Yelp maps don't show poor neighborhoods. Social apps cluster by consumption. Ride shares remap cities for efficiency, not equity. You are not exploring. You are being steered. The world is no longer discovered. It is delivered. 4. Warfare by waypoint. Modern warfare uses maps like crosshairs. Drone strikes depend on geolocation. Target lists are mapped, not questioned. Entire villages labeled hostile zones from thousands of miles away. One bad coordinate, one erased life. The cartographic era is no longer a harmless mistake. It is a mass grave. The internet as geography. Cyberspace is not metaphor. It is mapped terrain. IP addresses as virtual addresses. Domain names as plotted land, firewalls as borders, servers as fortresses. Governments now draw digital maps of threat. Dark web territories, disinformation clusters, data migration corridors. The Cold War had red lines. Now we have red nodes. The frontier is no longer west. It is encrypted. 6. The invisible layers. Modern maps have layers. Aerial imagery, traffic data, racial demographics, voting trends, disease spread policing patterns, economic forecasts. They are built not for humans, but for machines, governments, and predictive models. The city you walk through is not the same city seen by a police drone, a real estate algorithm, a military contractor, a corporate investor. Each has their own map, and yours is likely the least truthful. 7. Displacement in the age of the grid. Digital maps displace just like colonial ones. Gentrification is predicted by real estate heat maps, redlining resurrected in credit risk mapping. Climate refugees labeled as data flows, not people. Entire cultures unlisted because they don't generate profit. Even sacred lands, if unregistered in digital archives, do not exist to the algorithm. You cannot pray at a GPS pin. You cannot resurrect a river swallowed by pixels. End of chapter reflection. You are not on the map. You are in the map. We live in the age of the omniscient map, but it is not benevolent. It watches without listening. It remembers without reverence. It guides without compassion. Chapter 9. Counter-cartographies. Maps of rebellion, resistance, and reclamation. The master's map does not show the trapdoors, but the dissident draws in secret paths. If official cartography is about control, then counter-cartography is about escape. In every empire, there have been those who redrew the world, not for conquest, but for liberation. They made maps not to dominate, but to survive, to remember, to fight. And these maps still breathe, between the lines of the official record, underneath the satellite's gaze, beyond the edge of empire. The map as an act of resistance. Throughout history, oppressed peoples have mapped their own realities. Fugitive slaves created oral maps of safe houses. The Underground Railroad wasn't a railroad, it was a cartography of trust. Refugees memorized paths through mountains and borders by starlight. Occupied territories drew invisible borders of culture and language that defied the state. When you can't move freely, the map becomes a weapon or a prayer. These were not maps with legends. These were maps of legend. 2. Indigenous reclamation. For indigenous peoples, mapping has always been sacred. Land is not location. It is identity, story, spirit. To map it is to honor it, not possess it. Modern indigenous mapping projects have restored ancient place names, charted ancestral migration routes, identified sacred sites erased by colonial grids, fought legal battles using countermaps as evidence of genocide. Examples: the Zuni Salt Trail remapped through oral tradition and satellite imagery, the Mapuche of Chile creating political maps in the shape of their worldview, not European borders, Aboriginal Australian songline maps integrated with GPS to reclaim custodianship. To remap is to return. Even if the land was stolen, the memory never was. Third, psychogeography. Mapping emotion, not infrastructure. In post-industrial cities, artists and radicals began to map emotions, memories, oppression dreams, the situationists of 1950s. Paris invented dérive, the drift, walking through cities without purpose to break out of the grid. Their maps were scribbled, chaotic, beautiful. They showed where joy lived, where fear gathered, where capitalism collapsed, the soul. Modern artists continued this. Graffiti maps of gang territories, queer mapping projects tracing lost safe spaces, feminist mapping of street harassment zones. What is a dangerous place? The official map will never tell you. The real one does. 4. Digital guerrilla mapping. As surveillance grew, so did rebellion. OpenStreetMap let people chart their world without corporate bias. Activists created maps of police brutality, environmental destruction, censorship eviction hotspots. Hackers inserted ghost streets, secret gardens, banned countries, erased peoples. They made deep maps, layered with memory, pain, resistance. Some even mapped the unmappable. Transient homeless camps, war zones denied by governments, forgotten cemeteries bulldozed for highways. These weren't just maps. They were wounds made visible. Spiritual cartography. Mapping the unseen mystics, monks, and dreamers still map realms beyond reach. Tibetan thankas chart the soul's path after death. Sufi cosmographies show the journey through divine love. Mystery schools encoded initiatory landscapes within myth. Psychedelic maps trace visions seen in ayahuasca and LSD ceremonies. These are not maps for roads. They are maps for rebirth. And in a world obsessed with physical borders, these invisible maps offer another truth. Not all maps guide you across the world. Some guide you back to yourself. 6. Cartography as reversal. Some radical cartographers go further, turn maps upside down to subvert Eurocentricity, recenter the world around the global south, color-coded trauma zones rather than population centers, redraw the world in the image of justice, not power. They challenge the universal north-up orientation, the Mercator projection's white supremacy, the idea that some places deserve to be small, marginal, or invisible. If maps lie, then let us lie back, with better dreams. End of chapter reflection. Every empire draws a map. Every resistance redraws it. Maps are not neutral. They never were. But now, in the ruins of accuracy and the ashes of empires, new maps are blooming. Maps of grief. Maps of glory. Maps with monsters again, maps with memory. Chapter 10. Sacred geometry and cosmic grids mapping the divine and the destined. Long before the first border, there was the circle. Long after the last empire falls, the grid will remain, etched into the stars. Some maps were not drawn to navigate land, but to decode eternity. This is the cartography of the cosmos, of God's spirits and celestial order. A lattice of meaning deeper than nations, older than writing, traced in stone, stars, blood, and dream. Sacred geometry, the original design. Across cultures, sacred geometry whispered a universal truth. The circle, unity, the womb, the sun, the square, matter, foundation, mortality, the triangle, ascent, divinity, direction, the spiral, evolution, rebirth, eternity. These were not abstractions. They were cosmic instructions, maps to the divine encoded in temples, labyrinths, and body measurements. Examples: the flower of life carved into Egyptian temples, The Sri Yantra in Hindu cosmology, Kabbalistic tree of life as a multi-dimensional map of creation, the golden ratio in architecture from the Parthenon to Chartres Cathedral. To walk these shapes was to move through the divine, Seku, the celestial mapmakers. Ancient astronomer priests did not just observe the stars, they translated them into meaning. Babylonians charted omens across constellations. Chinese sky maps aligned the emperor's fate with the heavens. Maya star calendars predicted eclipses, rulers' deaths, and the rebirth of time. Navajo star maps served both as cosmology and migration guides. Islamic astrolabes pointed not just to Mecca, but to the divine order. These were not cold observations. They were living diagrams of balance between cosmos and man. Third, stargates and cosmic grids around the world. Ancient sites align with stars, not randomly, but systematically. Giza pyramids mirror Orion's belt. Stonehenge aligns with solstices. Teotihuacan mimics the layout of the Milky Way. Angkor Wat mirrors the Draco constellation. Nazca lines, unseeable from ground, map the heavens and beneath them. A theorist's whisper of ley lines, invisible energy currents, grids that connect temples, megaliths, mountains, points where spirit touches matter. Were these maps? Portals? Circuits in the Earth's body? Maybe the planet was always holy and they were just drawing its veins. 4. Mythical geography, the other realm's sacred cartography, does not stop at the physical. The map expands into mythic space. Eden, 4 rivers flowing from the Garden of Origin, Asgard, realm of the gods linked by the rainbow bridge Bifrost Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting the 9 realms, Mount Meru, the center of the universe in Hindu-Buddhist cosmology. The Duat, Egypt's underworld, navigated by the dead using the Book of Gates, the dream time, where Aboriginal Australians walk the paths of the ancestors, heaven, mapped in tiers, circles, spheres, in Dante, Swedenborg, Islamic Mi'raj. These maps were not metaphors. They were realms, accessed through right, vision, death, or madness. V. the esoteric cartographers. Throughout time, certain visionaries and heretics tried to bring it all together. Pythagoras mapped the music of the spheres. Hermeticists combined astrology, alchemy, and geography. Mr. D sought to map angelic languages and astral planes. Renaissance mappers hid occult codes in their globes. Theosophists traced Lemuria, Atlantis, and the Akashic records. Their maps straddled the boundary between revelation and madness. To most, they were dangerous. To some, they were the last true cartographers. Cars, the modern echoes. Even within our hyper-digital era, echoes of sacred cartography persist. Circular patterns in fields mirror ancient geometrical motifs. Cognitive imaging reveals fractal patterns inside the human brain. Meditative visions often reflect symbols drawn centuries ago by monks. Computer-generated star diagrams resemble spiritual blueprints. Cutting-edge science begins to describe principles that once lived in myth and metaphor. We circle back, always. End of chapter reflection. In the end, all maps turn inward. Sacred cartography is less about where you are and more about what you're aligned with. It's the resonance between soul and sky, memory and earth, logic and story. The pattern was always there. We're just learning how to read it again. Closing chapter. Sources, realms, and further study. A cartographic index of all worlds, spiritual, historical, mythical, and scientific. When the map ends, the search begins. What you hold now is not the truth. It is the trailhead. This chapter is the skeleton key. The deep ledger. The companion that validates every shadow and symbol you've seen along this journey. Organized by theme and terrain, cross-referencing the sacred and the scholarly, the mythical and the material. I, primal maps and human origins. Terrains, prehistoric cave markings, Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, Aboriginal Australian songlines, Paleolithic star maps, e.g. the Pleiades carved into mammoth bone, Göbekli Tepe cosmography, Proto-Babylonian maps, Imago Mundi, Nabta Playa, prehistoric stone calendar in Egypt. 2. Sacred textual geography, biblical and Abrahamic realms, Garden of Eden, Genesis 2, Tigris and Euphrates origins, Noah's world map, TO map tradition, Tower of Babel as ziggurat cartography, Heavenly Jerusalem, Revelation 21, City of Cubic Perfection, Quranic geography, the seven heavens, Surahs 67-3, 65-12, Isra and Miraj, Muhammad's night journey through cosmic stations, Mount Qaf and the Emerald Mountains beyond reality Jewish mysticism, Kabbalistic tree of life as a vertical map of creation, Sephirothic realms, and spiritual layers. The third. Classical and mythical cosmologies. Norse, Yggdrasil and the Nine Realms, Asgard, Midgard, Hel, etc. Bifrost, bridge as a divine connection point. Greek, Oceanus encircling flat Earth, Tartarus, and Olympus mapped as vertical domains. Ptolemaic geocentric heavens, Hindu, Buddhist, Mount Meru cosmology, Axis Mundi at world center. Mandala structures as internal and external maps. The Wheel of Samsara as soul geography. I4. Earthly empires and map dominance cultures and cartographic powers. Babylonian star charts and ziggurat maps. Roman military road maps. Tabula Peutingeriana. Islamic Golden Age geography. Al-Idrisi's world map. Medieval Mappamundi. Hereford Ebstorff. European colonial atlases, Mercator projection, Ortelius, Chinese Han Dynasty terrain surveys and Ming maritime maps, Zheng He, Polynesian stick charts, Marshall Islands wave-based navigation, V technological mapping and global monitoring tools and systems, Landsat Earth imaging, 1972 present, Global Positioning System, GPS, Geographic Information Systems, GIS, Google Earth and digital terrain modeling, drones and military cartographic surveillance, predictive policing maps and algorithmic borders, VSI. Counter-cartography, resistance and memory movements, indigenous mapping movements, Mapuche countermaps, Zuni Salt Trail, Aboriginal Dreamtime geography, psychogeography, situationist international queer mapping and urban derive, redlining maps as racial trauma archives, digital guerrilla mapping, open street map activism crisis mapping, e.g. Ushahidi in Kenya, environmental resistance cartographies. 7. Cosmic, spiritual, and occult geographies, sacred geometry and astral grids, Flower of Life, Egypt, Leonardo da Vinci's journals, Golden Ratio, Fibonacci spiral in nature and architecture, Sri Yantra and Vastu Shastra, India, Tibetan mandalas, Kalachakra cosmograms, Masonic tracing boards as metaphysical floor plans, cosmic alignment, Pyramid Orion correlation theory, Stonehenge's solstice alignment, Nazca lines as stellar cartography, Chaco Canyon celestial chambers, Teotihuacan, Milky Way mirror city. 8. Classified, lost, and speculative sources. Theorized or reconstructed maps. Atlantis, Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, Lemuria and Mu, Theosophical Society, Blavatsky, Akashic records, clairvoyant mapping of soul history, cymatics and frequency-based spatial structuring, CIA remote viewing maps, Stargate Project. The Voynich Manuscript, undeciphered Cosmic Botanical Atlas. 9. Recommended archives and sources to study. Physical British Library, Mappamundi Collection, Vatican Apostolic Library, Secret Cartography Section, Library of Congress, Map Division Institute of Cultural Cartography, Lisbon UNESCO, Memory of the World Program, Indigenous and Historical Maps, Online and Interactive, David Rumsey Map Collection, https://www.davidrumsey.com, Perry Castaneda Map Library, UT Austin, OpenStreetMap.org. Esri ArcGIS Living Atlas, CIA World Factbook Cartography Archive, Digital Atlas of Roman and Medieval Civilizations, Harvard. Final word. All maps lie, but the best ones lie beautifully, guiding us not just across land but into legend. Now you possess the atlas of everything. The official and the outlawed, the divine and the damned, the data and the dream. Whatever map you make from here, let it be drawn with reverence. Let it remember the forgotten, protect the sacred, and lead you home, wherever that may be.